Okay, we are in Matthew chapter 24, and we're going to be in Matthew 25 also as well. So if you want to, you can follow along. Ultimately, we're going to start in verse 45 of chapter 24. You know, our human tendency is to always not only want to be prepared, but sometimes we have a delusional thought that we really are prepared. And, you know, we graduate, I have to keep looking at it to make sure nobody's trying to get in. Okay, I guess I heard something. You know, we think when we're in high school that we're prepared to go to college until we get to college. Then we go, oops, I wasn't quite ready for that. And we get to college or get to a job and we say, hey, I think I'm ready for this job, or I'm ready for this new job after college, or we're not. We all think, well, we're ready to get married. No, I don't think we are. If you've been married for very long, you know that what you thought here is not what it is down the road. So we think that our age and everything is going to prepare us and get us ready for the next thing or whatever we're supposed to do or be. And that really is a delusion. And it's probably that way in our spiritual lives as well. We, you don't have to say anything. I'm going to speak for me, and I think it'll resonate with most of you. We talked last week about our baptisms being a transactional activity. The preacher says, here's what you need to do. We read the Bible and it says, here's what you're supposed to do. And then you say, okay, I'm going to do that. And you get baptized. And for many people, that's as far as it goes. They don't progress after that for whatever reason. They stop coming. They get baptized when they're 15 and then they go off to college and they never set foot in the church again. Or, you know, things happen in life and their baptism doesn't bear fruit. We don't see any manifestation of what they professed. They thought they were ready, but they really don't follow through on it. And in a lot of ways, that's what Jesus is telling his disciples about their walk with him. And in verse 45, this is going to be one of the final parables in Matthew. And as you know, not all of the parables are shown up in every one of the gospel books in the same way. And this is obviously Matthew's version of this. But if you look at this scripture right here, he says, who then is the faithful and wise servant whom the master has put in charge of the servants in his household to give them their food at the proper time? He starts out with a question. You know, usually you get an explanation, you get a story, you get a lesson, and then the teacher asks you, so what? But he starts out with a question. And he says, who then is the faithful and wise servant? And as we look at this, notice he doesn't say he wants to know who the faithful is. He doesn't ask which one is. Is it this one or this one? It's not a two. There's one servant. And he wants to know, will he be faithful? Come on in. And he says, it will be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns. I tell you the truth, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But suppose that servant is wicked and says to himself, my master is staying away a long time, and then begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with drunkards. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, at an hour he is not aware of. He will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and grinding of teeth. We have that same kind of idea of the master being away from the servants and the servant not knowing when the past master is going to come back. This isn't the only parable or story that has that kind of concept to it. In fact, if you look in chapter 25, I just did something wrong. Oh, yeah, no, I said it right. In 25, we had the parable of the 10 virgins, and then we also had the parable of the talents. And those two parables that he's talking about there are really about being prepared. The 10 virgins, who was prepared and who wasn't? Who was ready for the feast and who wasn't? Now, he does start off with this particular clause, and he asks that question, and it causes us to think then that we confess to be followers of Christ, and we should be faithful. And one of the hallmarks of us being prepared as disciples is realizing that he is going to come back. Now, he asked it, like I said, in the form of a question. And the way the question's posed, there's an implication that there are few that will be found faithful.
Well, the way he asked the question is kind of the way when I read scripture sometimes I ask, what does that look like in a Christian's life? When he says to have joy, peace, kindness, qualities like that. And I often go to a question in my mind, what does that look like? And then you see him in doing that there. And it brings on deeper thoughts of who we're supposed to be and how, what does that faithful and wise servant look like?
And I appreciate you saying that, because that's the rest of my lesson. He is pulling those, he pulled those disciples aside, and he's saying, because we talked about this before, he told them, first of all, I want you to know there's going to be hard times, there's going to be chaos, there's going to be a time when the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed, there's going to be hard times in your life. And he's saying, now, while you're waiting for that, and he had told him that he's going to return. He didn't tell him when, but he's saying, while you're waiting for all this, here is what you need to be like. And that's why we're going to look at 24 and 25. But you'll notice he often alluded to the fact that there's few. We mentioned it before about the wide gate and the narrow gate, and there's few that are going to get through. He's not talking about the masses. He's not even talking, if you think about it, about the majority of the church. And that's kind of a scary thought, because we all come here thinking, we got it made. We came to the church. Just like the Jews thought, we got it made. We came to the temple, and the temple was destroyed. And it's not the church building. We talked about this last week. It's not the church. And even within the church, the people, few will make it. There's not a guarantee that just because you walk down the aisle and say, I want to be baptized, let me fill out my card so you can get my name correct in the bulletin next week, that you're going to be one of those few. And he's telling them here, in tonight's lesson, we're going to look at what it is that we're supposed to be. From the
it seems to me like when he's asking this question, he's got his disciples pulled over to the side and he's talking to them that they've made a commitment. And I think what he's saying here, to a certain degree, is these servants have made a commitment to follow their masters, you know, whatever he told them and then what he wanted them to do. He's got a commitment to do what he said.
right.
And they're self-starting. They're not, well, I'm waiting for you to tell me to do something. I'm waiting for you to do this. I'm waiting. It's and the Christians have made a commitment to Christ, and they need to follow him, even though they are not. Well, I'd say ardent Christians, maybe, or might be the word. They're not really committed like they should. But I think that's a sign of commitment there that he's talking about. That I'm committed to Christ, and therefore I should follow him, whether I'm around Christians or whether I'm around whoever I'm around. I may be way off.
And hold that thought. As we get into chapter 25, we're going to look and see what that commitment looks like. So, he says a second thing here. He expects out of this commitment. He wants to know, this guy who's put in charge of the servants in his household, it was his responsibility to give them their food at the proper time. Now, we can look at that and say, their food, what are we bringing to, what is this servant doing for those people? He's feeding them. And we can make that parallel. What are the disciples supposed to be doing? We're supposed to be taking the food, God's word, to the people, and we're responsible for doing that. And that's part of that commitment thing. Now, as we look at this, though, he's hinting at it, and he uses the word for this person, and he uses the word phronimos. And I am not a Greek scholar, so don't ask me to do all this. And this, the person, phronimos, is characterized by a sensibility. He has good judgment. He's excellent character. He has excellent habits, and that's what that word is referring to. And usually in the Greek, that word phronesis is the result. Phronimos is the person. Phronesis is the result of all that. And if you are a person of intelligence, character, good habits, etc., you will be blessed. He's not going to be the one where the master is going to come back and punish him. He's going to be the one that's going to be blessed and happy. And all that's tied up in that Greek word. So if you want to go home and study, well, you're welcome to do that. Now, Larry, you said this last week. In Romans 3:10, Paul says, no one is righteous, not even one. And we refer to that. But there is something that's accomplished in our life with intentionality. there is something that's accomplished in our life by developing those habits and using our intellect and our good character, our intelligence. But what we need to realize, though, is it doesn't come naturally. Everything that we are and do generally is antithetical to what God is and wants done. Just by nature, we're not what God is. We want to be. We want to be drawn to that, but our nature is not that. And there's kind of I guess an ebb and flow. And I'm going to get, have to be careful what I'm saying here. For a long time in the church, things were very staid, very sacred, and they were in a box. And man has wanted to make that more than just an intellectual experience. They wanted it to be more experiential. We want to feel. And we talk about feeling the joy in a worship service and things like that. And we've had conversations, some of us in this room, depending on who you are, what day it is, and things like that. You can walk into a worship service over here and walk out and say, I didn't feel it today. I just didn't, it didn't do much for me today. Dale may be a good preacher to them, but today, zip. And we have those opinions, we have those days. I'm going to make a statement here. Our relationship with God doesn't care how high we can jump, how much movement we can do, whether we can hold our hands up. Do you read any of that in the Bible anywhere? You don't. I mean, I'm not saying it's wrong, and that's not the point. I'm not here to talk about worship service and what it could or shouldn't be. So don't read that into this. I just want you to know that there are ethical implications of the faith that we're going to look at tonight that are important. I'm going to say that again. We can worship him in a lot of different ways, but the ethical implications that we're going to talk about here tonight are the ones that make the difference. And, sir. Yes. You may not recognize yourself as a sir. I'm sorry.
Well, I was wondering about our ways are not God's ways, and when we're trying to get to know him and actually have a desire to be sharpened spiritually, and I look for ways and people to do that, but the one that's really going to sharpen me the most is this word. But it is also very comforting to find like people when we come to worship that they can do exactly what we're doing here. We're looking into that word and it's sharpening us, and we are being sharpened together. And you can't get that outside of Christ and outside of being with the body. And when you're with the body, it's just that much more meaningful, and it gives us a view to what we're running the race for. And those godly people that are in your life are nothing compared to what God's like. But yet we crave, at least I do, to be around godly people.
And I'm not saying we shouldn't, so don't get me
But it's hard to be like that, because just before we went into this, you said something that reminded me of that. It's hard to be like that. It goes against some of our nature to be like that.
I'm gonna touch on some scripture just to, in 7th chapter of Matthew, verse 24, Jesus says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on rock. And it's that wise man, that thinking man, that sensible man that we're talking about here in this Greek word that he's referring to. In chapter 10, he says, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves, therefore be as shrewd as snakes and innocent as doves. He wants us to be as wise as those serpents that are going to tempt us. Paul in Romans chapter 12 says, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. There's a key thought there. Renew your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And we can find that in the Proverbs, and I have a whole lot of other scriptures here in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and several others in Philippians and so on. Now, if you'll remember, we started this thing in week 1, and those of you who weren't here won't know this, but we started off with the key thought that being a disciple is a vocational activity. It's a vocation. Where we are, where our feet are, is where we're supposed to be working disciples. And our attitude should be, and a lot of people do this, and we've had, how many sermons have you heard? Well, you come to church on Sunday and then you're different on Monday. Or Friday night you're this way and then you come to church and you're this way. And being a disciple, this whole 4 weeks is talking about the idea of being a disciple. It is a vocation. It's something that you should have in your mind that I'm going to be doing all the time, wherever I am, in whatever way I can. And it comes from, like you said, the study of the word. And we see in scripture multiple times this idea of strengthening the mind so that you can be that. That's what he was referring to here in this verse. Like I said, this is a lesson where I can step on a lot of people's toes and make you mad at me. Gotta help them. Well, good. Yeah, you say that. I know. Okay. I want you to, when he's talking about the servant who's going to be punished, there's a lot of talk there about what he's saying about them and the punishment and everything. If somebody's going to be blessed, and if they're going to be, because they're faithful, you'll notice that when he's in this parable here, when he talks about the master coming home and finding the servant, he's not talking about those servants who are sitting in the church when he returns. He's not talking about those servants who are reading the Bible when he returns. He doesn't expect you to be sitting on a chair, anxiously waiting, reading the Bible. Oh, good, he came just at the right time. He caught me, reading the Bible. He's not blessing them if they're praying. What's the antithesis, antithesis? What's the opposite? He's talking about the faithful and wise servant. And also the opposite, the unfaithful servant. Now, when he's comparing those two, it's the same man. It's the same person. And the faithful servant is going to be the one who is feeding the people. How is he taking care of that household? Isn't that the idea here that he's talking about? That servant was supposed to be taking care of that household. And if he didn't do it, if he didn't feed them, if he didn't take care of them, if he didn't read them right, if he was out running around with the drunkards, if he was not doing what he was supposed to do that was sensible as the person in charge, then he was going to be punished. And but it's a thing that he was expecting him to do. And I'm not saying that our salvation is based on works, so don't read that into that. But if you are faithful, if you are doing what Jesus wants us to do, will we not be doing things for him to others? We will be active as Christians doing things. Now, if I mentioned about the household thing, I could go off on and I am guilty of this. I felt as a father that I needed to pay the bills, take care of my kids, make sure they had a house, make sure they had, and I did not spend the same time and energy that I should have with my kids. Did I spend time with them? Yes. Did I try and teach them? Yes. But as I look back on it, I have a tendency to say, what could I have done better? I don't know if you relate to that or not. We all are critical of how we raised our kids properly. I mean, if you think you did it perfectly, after class, you can tell me, and I'm going to write a book and make a lot of money. I don't think none of us ever feel like we've done it perfectly.
Isn't it also, I mean, I'm not saying we should get leeways, but if we're out there trying, you know, I'm sure nobody's ever done it perfectly like you're joking about. So, but there are people who are making the effort. I think that's what he's saying here is, you know, make the effort, read your Bible as much as you can, pray as much as you can, serve others as much as you can, and don't worry about the outcomes as much as like, did I do it right? Did I do it? Don't do it right.
There's a lot of truth in what you're saying.
So
He doesn't say that the guy had to be perfect in doing it.
Yeah.
But and as we look further into this, we're going to see that there are some things that he does expect us to do.
yeah.
We can turn our Bible study, we can turn our Christian walk into something that's really intellectual. We talk about studying the Bible, and I told you earlier that I'm not a Greek scholar, and maybe I should have taken Greek courses or something, but I'm going to fall back on what you said, Barry. I tried. Now, the idea, though, is that how many of you in here know what superlapsarianism is? I didn't think so. Now,
Is it also the prolapsarianism?
yeah, there is a pro, there's other lapsarianisms too. Now, basically, and I'm not going to give you a whole lesson on this, basically, there are those who believe that God predestined individuals, and what happened to them in their lives was part of this lapsarianism. But there are others who believe that he put man on earth and left it up to man to make the decisions. So there's predestination stuff and there's not predestination stuff. And that's as simple as I'm going to make it for you. But if you want to, you can look up that super lapsarianism stuff and your head will go like this because it really is kind of complicated. And that's a result of people who are taking something that's very simple about Christianity and making it so very hard. And to boot, they make big words to explain it. You know? So I'm not going to get into all the whether you're condemned, predestined, condemned to be a sinner or not. In verse 48, he says, "But if that evil slave says in his heart," now, this isn't another person. Remember, this whole thing is about one man. So if he says an evil slave, if he says, in his heart that the master isn't coming, but if he says in his heart, my master is not coming for a long time, and begins to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with drunkards, if he goes about that, that is going to put him in a place with hypocrites, and we see at the end of the parable, there's going to be thrown into a place with weeping and gnashing of teeth and everything. And one of the things that it's easy for us to do is to not live with this concept. Remember, lesson 1 and 2, we're dealing with Jesus warning his people, warning the disciples. There's going to be in this world wars, rumors of wars, chaos. There's going to be trouble. There's going to be things. The temple's going to be destroyed. And I want you to know that I am coming back. And they asked, give me a sign. And he said, what? There is no sign. When I'm here, I'm here. That's your sign. If we go about like this slave and say, it's 2021, you ain't come yet, I got time. Do we? We don't know. That's what this whole thing is about. We're looking at this as disciples that we don't have the time to be able to say what we can do or what we're not going to do. I'm going to put this out there so you can fill in the blank. The beginning of wisdom is to fear the Lord. You get an extra credit. Oh, I like you. I'll give you 2.
I like you too.
Okay. We have to fear God. We have to take this stuff seriously. We can't underestimate what's going on. Now, I don't want to give the next 2. Look at this. I don't want to give the next 2 parables short shrift. How many of you have ever heard that term? Short shrift. Okay. Just didn't want to make you think I was mispronouncing things. The parable of the 10 virgins. What's the point in it? I'm not going to spend a lot of time to be prepared. And what about the parable of the talents? That's a little bit, you need to be prepared, but there's a little more to that.
Be wise with it.
Be wise with it. And that's that faithfulness. That's that using those character traits that I was talking about here to be a good, faithful servant. So he's followed up with this parable of the faithful or unfaithful, saying you have a choice. You can be this guy or you can be this guy. He's not comparing the two, because what happens when he starts doing things where we compare people? Well, I know Randy, I'm a little bit better than he is. You know, I'm not the evil one. You know, it's easy to do a comparison, but what he's saying here in this parable is you can be both. As an individual, you can be both. You can ignore the fact that Jesus is going to come and not do what it is that you're supposed to do. And then he gives them these two others, kind of as, I'll do the teacher thing here for you. Kelly was a teacher, I don't know who else is teachers in here. There you go. You introduce a concept, and then you give them an example, right? And then you have them do something with it. And then ultimately there is an application. And then you go on to the next concept. And I shortened that. My education professors were failing to put that diagram.
That makes math easy.
Yeah,
People don't believe that, but that does make it easy.
it does make it easier if you do it that way. And so he has these two parables that are in there that he's using. He sets these scenes all the time for situations. We need to keep in our mind that Jesus is teaching to them right now. He's teaching to them for the very last time. Because as we get past chapter 25, we see the plot against Jesus, and he's already told them, soon they're going to come and I'm going to be handed over to them. And we should have talked about that in the first week. I don't know if Sean did or not. But what happened to Jesus was a passive thing. It wasn't active on his part. It wasn't something he did. He didn't crucify himself. He didn't do these things. It wasn't an active thing on his part. It happened to him. And most of the things in our life happen to us. Now, he's trying to teach them that, and what does he tell Peter? Does he say, Peter, yeah, you're going to live a long, glorious life, and you're going to love that senior home that your kids are going to put you in Florida? You know, he tells him. He tells all of them, you're going to suffer like I did. And he warns them that this disciple thing is not an easy thing for them to face. And in this last parable, the sheep and the goats, it's on page 64 in my Bible. Verse 31. And we won't read the whole thing. I mean, I know everybody in here has heard it 100 times probably. Parable of the sheep and the goats. Now, anybody want to sum it up? In a sentence or two?
Live right and be saved, live wrong and be condemned.
That's right.
Do it all the way.
And if you're going to live right, you're going to be a sheep. If you're going to live wrong, you're going to be a goat. Now, but there's hidden in there something that's really important. Let's look at this and say, starting in verse 34, then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. Now remember, kind of paint this picture. If not all of you, most of you in here know that I have two gay children. You didn't know that, you know it now. Are they living according to the Bible? No. Do they know that I'm not happy with that? Yes. Are they changing? Not that I know of, but there's always hope. Now, if I were to get really sick right now, and two of my kids came to me, I would probably say something along these lines. For over 20 years, you've lived this way. How has it benefited you? Has it worked for you? Why don't you try what I taught you? Why would, now, don't you think on your dying bed, you would probably want to take your children aside and tell them the one thing that you want them to know? The last time you're going to talk to them, you're going to say, you got to know this. Now, based on that, let's look at this last thing he's teaching them. This is his last conversation with them. And he tells them about the sheep and the goats. What did the sheep say when he said this? When did I do this? When did I go there? When did I do all those things? And how does he respond? I tell you the truth, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me. I'm going to tell you that some commentaries will tell you the least of these brothers, he may be mentioning the disciples, that he wants his disciples taken care of. There are many who don't say that. I'm going to opt for this lesson to say this is something that's applicable to all of us. Now, a couple key words there. Whatever you did, I want to focus on the did, and to the least of these brothers. Now, quick story. Kelly will remember this, and Randy probably will too. I don't know if Randy will. We've told Randy. None of you know this story, I don't think. There used to be a thing called LTC, Leadership Training for Christ. And we would haul kids down to Dallas. One time, my oldest daughter, who when she was faithful to the Lord, went with Santi to Mexico. She did it many times. And they went to the children's home. And she loved on those children. And she came back and we piled her in the car, hauled her off to LTC in Dallas. And we got to the hotel room and she had lice. Okay. How long do you think it took for people to find out and the gossip mill to go, Kelsey has lice. Did you know Kelsey has lice? The hallways were empty. Nobody wanted to be around Kelsey or Les because there was lice. Somebody said, well, I was going to invite this friend of mine. She's the daughter of these really important people here in Lubbock. I'm glad she didn't come. I mean, what would she think about Greenlawn if we had kids running around with lice? And my first thought was, if you tell her to come to Greenlawn, she might get lice. Because how did Kelsey, when she was good, she's so good, good girl, just another story. But she was loving. She was taking care of those orphans. She was sacrificing and getting lice. But is that not what Jesus is saying here? He wants us to take care of the least. Now, second story. I don't know that I've ever heard, I need to ask Dale about this. I don't know that I've ever heard anybody come up to Dale after a Sunday thing and say, we had so-and-so in the audience today, and you didn't recognize them. You could have said, the mayor's sitting in our audience, or whoever. I don't know if anybody says that to him or not, but I'm sure that that happens in churches where they go, we got some big name people here. It could be a rock star, or it could be whoever. What are they worried about? There are small people that are interested in big things and big people. But they're really small people because they're not focused on what they're supposed to be focused on. That's not what Jesus didn't go around telling the disciples. See if you can find the most popular person in town and hang out with them. He told them to go find the people with lice. That's who you need to be with. The least, the ones who don't have, they don't have the food, they're in prison, they don't have the stuff that everybody else has. They don't have the influence, they don't have the power, they don't have any of the stuff that we in this world put stock in. And that's what's going on here in this final teaching. I'm not going to ask you to recite all the Beatitudes, but the Sermon on the Mount, what was he talking about? Can you name some of them? Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the poor in spirit. But
This is 130 righteousness.
Right. He's not talking about blessed are those who are mighty, blessed are those who have, and so on. The whole point, he started on the Sermon on the Mount early in Matthew, early in all the other Gospels, and that was his point. You're not going out to serve those people. He's already criticized the Pharisees and the scribes. He's already criticized the politicians. He's already talked to the people who, after they got their food, after they got their whatever they needed from him, after they were interested in self, walked away from him. He's talking about those people who need him. And in that, and again, lesson 2, isn't this kind of what we talked about is happening in Africa? There's a tremendous amount of good stuff happening in Africa. We have probably more missionaries coming from other countries here to work in the United States than we have going out there. I'm just guessing. We're content. The church, not only just Church of Christ, the people who seek to emulate Christ in America are content with taking care of themselves. Yeah, we have a blessing center. We'll take care of people on Tuesdays and Thursdays. But what about the people that have needs on Monday and Friday and Saturday, That's what he's talking about. And I'm not being critical, I'm not telling you that Green Lawn doesn't help people on Saturdays. We do. We have people that help people all the time. But we're talking about what his vision of the disciples is, I think. Questions or comments?
I'm reminded of my school, my dad told me from Tennessee, they said that Andrew Jackson, who was president, attended the service up there, and somebody got up and told the preacher, now be careful what you say, Andrew Jackson's in the audience, And the preacher got up and said, well, I understand President Jackson's with us, I appreciate that, but I'll tell him like I tell everybody else, you better get right with God, it won't be long. And they said he liked it. And they said maybe that's the bill. He said he appreciated what the preacher said. So whoever's out there, we
People,
he preached through.
yeah, the people who are looking for it, I'm gonna touch on this. Quick story. when I was working as a youth person in Florida, unfortunately, this youth minister guy went on to become part of the Boston movement. And if you don't know what that is, you'll have to look it up and find out. It turned into a real cult type thing. But he came down to do a thing with our youth. And unbeknownst to me, he knew he was coming. And he got as scraggly as he could get. He got as dirty as he could get. He got as scummy looking as he could get. And he kind of sauntered in to the church just as it was about to start. And he sauntered down to the front. And you could see people, there were elbows jabbing people all over that auditorium. You know, and fingers pointing and wagging and whispering and stuff. And there, because he was not dressed like they were, and he wasn't like them. And I got up to say, okay, now's the time for, and he stood up to talk, and you should have seen all the jaws dropping, because they didn't expect him to be the guy they were listening to. And so this disciple thing, what we're seeing here with Jesus in the last sentence, we're supposed to be a different kind of creature as a disciple. We're supposed to use our minds. We're supposed to have those character traits. We're supposed to do those things. Nowhere in there, Barry, did he say that we had to be perfect at it. And so, because we're not going to be. But it's a reminder to me, if we're going to start talking about being a disciple at Greenlawn, then it's an everyday thing for each and every one of us. It's not a program that we're going to have the church do. It's not a committee that you can get on. You are the committee. And the message is, go out and be a disciple.